Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 12. This is our last theme of thematic, last theme in our last block. And here we'll be talking about Postwork. And I want you to think of Postwork in a more theoretical approach, because what I will try to convey is this sort of future utopia of post-work, of what will happen to society when we don't have work. And I'm thinking that concept necessarily through the present. So I'm thinking about the future through the present. And what I want you to do while I'm doing this is think of some type of transnational grounding, and I'll be referring about some of them in the lecture. But think about what are some of these transnational networks and actors, whether at the institutional level or geopolitical level or cultural level, that are interfering with this utopian vision of post-work. What are the interferences that make post-work not feasible from a transnational level, or that could make it feasible at a transnational level? So that's for you to decide. I will, in fact, making the case that the idea of post-work is problematic. But I want you to think of the other side of the coin, and how maybe there is an anchor today, and I will be referring to that in a second, that actually makes the idea of post-work possible. And when I mean possible, doesn't mean desirable, but basically possible, right? And what are those? So think about, try to anchor what I will be a kind of theoretical lecture. I hope not too much. Try to anchor it in a transnational context, at whichever level you think it should be anchored, right? So basically, we're talking about the future, but as I will explain later, every time we talk about the future, we're really talking about the present, or at least we're talking from a present worldview that is just inescapable. And the current logic, when it comes to the idea of future work, has basically to do with the loss of labor, or the different type of jobs that will be lost because artificial intelligence and automation, right? And these arguments about the future of work are mostly technocratic. That is, they're looking at work as if it was completely separated from a political decision-making process, as if these technologies appear out of the blue in a bubble, and it is the tools that cause all this supposed destruction of future jobs. So I'm just going to play, and this Vice News report is the kind of quintessential approach to the future of jobs. So I'm just going to play a little clip that represents or portrays what I'm talking about.
Formerly a tech CEO, Marty Chavez is now global co-head of Goldman's securities division.
It strikes me, obviously, that this is an industry that has been on the forefront of using AI, computers to, make big decisions and make a lot of money. What has that done to the kind of, the job market even within this company?
It's creating new jobs that couldn't have existed before. Whole new businesses now exist for us and out in the world that wouldn't have been possible without the technologies that have arisen over the past few years, whether they're machine learning, cloud services, open source, right? All of those activities go into, for instance, our new consumer lending and deposit taking activity.
You know the counter argument to this, don't you? These are jobs that are being created for smart people, educated people, rich people. The other people out there who are being made redundant by robots don't have the skills. It's only for a rarefied few. How do you respond to that?
Technological change is disruptive, and there's a lot of pain, and it's something that we must concern ourselves with. What do you do during the disruption, which has been continuous since the agricultural and industrial revolutions, and I expect it will continue and will accelerate in all likelihood. And so sitting back and complaining about it, sitting back and doing nothing about it, don't seem to be options. At the same time, I don't think the answer is to stop the progression of technology. Haven't seen that work.
Right. So if you really think about it, this kind of approach of the pro and con arguments, right? Are you pro-technology or are you anti-technology? It really misses the main point, which is technology is simply the part of a process, economic and political process, that uses it to advance a form of social relation, what John Rawls calls social relations. That is a way that society, that individuals in society interact with each other to in the public sphere, whether it's at work, at the family level, at the institutional level, right? This social relation, within that social relation, there is a technology, and that technology is simply advancing a political and economic way of creating a type of society. So the advancement of the printing press at the time created a disruption, for instance, when it came to the imparting of religion, not so much because of the printing press, but because there was the Lutheran Revolution, and the idea of a priest should not interpret God's word to the people that kind of read, but the people should be reading God's word and interpret it by themselves. That was already a Lutheran, a worldview, a social relation that was put in place. And the printing press what it simply did is facilitated what was already in place. In this case, a political view, a different political view of religion, right? So this is the point that I want you to really reflect on, and the point that this kind of approach, the mainstream approach, doesn't really make, which treats it as if it was an atmospheric phenomenon. Technology simply dropped from the sky, has nothing to do with a pathway that is envisioned already, that is conscious, and that has been planned, and is simply following an established plan. And that plan can be disrupted. It could be disrupted for the better or for the worse. So in here, I'm not putting any negative or positive value. So I don't adjudicate positive or negative value to this, right? And you can see this in the future of work and death in the documentary that it's also being assigned. One of the questions in there is that really all this talk about technology, AI, and automation, it's really a political question, right? And when it comes to post-work, the idea of a society without work, it's about post-work ideology. And we have to question if that ideology works or doesn't work. If it's serving already a pathway that it's already established in late capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, and then we're treating it, or like the mainstream arguments are treating it as technocratic because it's the best way for that already established pathway to keep going, right? But before I advance that post-work ideology, or I talk a little bit more about post-work ideology, let's look at the basically two main scenarios when it comes to post-work societies. And UBI, universal basic income, that is that is an income that everybody should have, an income that will cover everybody's needs at a universal level, regardless of your if you make a lot or just a very little money. So that's UBI, universal basic income, right? That will be an income that everybody will get, regardless of how much money they're making. That is at the center of post-work society. So that is a society without work, and also with a work ethic, and that is important. But a society in which jobs won't be relevant because nobody will have jobs, and basically robots will be doing all the work, needs a UBI, a universal basic income. But that's at the center of post-work ideology. And there are two different types of scenarios. We have the sort of like future socialist society, in which everybody will be free from work, and especially from the work ethic, the idea that work is part of your identity and it's part of a worthy identity, right? The work ethic. And if you think about work ethics, think about the Protestant work ethic, which is kind of the version that has been globalized after the U.S. hegemony in post-World War II, with work at the center of everything. It is a stupid example of but it's very telling, right? That in English-speaking society, when you're meeting someone, you tell them, what is it you do, right? What is your work? And non-English, say, in Latin America or in Spain, we don't ask that type of question, or we ask it in much less frequently. It's not very common to ask, what do you do for a living? So that is the work ethic that is today. So we will be free in a future socialist society from that work, and what we'll do with our time, we'll use our time however we see fit, right? Now, in a future, there is the capitalist version of that, or the turbo capitalist version of that, when capitalism has advanced so rapidly and so fast that basically there will be no jobs for people and everything, and the capitalist machine will be so efficient through automation that people will be rendered useless. So, and that's when UBI comes in the picture, right? UBI is in this case is the tool, the necessary policy, not so much tool, but policy, that will keep the capitalist machine going at that level, right? And it's not an attack on work ideology, on work ethic, but the opposite. It's a way to incorporate people or a majority of people, or a great number of people that have been rendered useless, into the marketplace, because that will be the way that these people can consume the products that the hyper-productive turbo-capitalist machine is creating, right? And because they need the money to consume this product, because capitalism is basically predicated on consuming the goods that capitalism creates, right? In that way, it's not only not an attack on work ideology and work ethic, but it's an incorporation of that ethic at the core of what we do. But more importantly, that work ethic now is unwaged. It's not tied to a wage. The work ethic it's now converted into a way of working for free. It's an unwaged work, because if you think about that future hyper-capitalist society in which we will have a UBI, we are consumers, but we are providing our work for free, because in the future, cognitive capitalism will be the only game in town. That is, our data will be, and we giving our data and being being inserted in all these different social media platforms and social and online marketplace will be the way that these companies will be making money, right? So we will be giving our data for free. That's part of our labor, right? Our value, so not so much labor, our value that can be converted in surplus value for these companies will be given away for free because we have a UBI, right? That in which we cannot work for a wage, but we'll be giving a wage for free by the government. And in that way, what we're doing, and what this UBI proposal is really referring to, is a way to socialize private wage expenditure. All of a sudden, these companies that doesn't have to provide a wage, the government will, and will be giving and they will be extracting value from us because we'll be giving our data for free. And here, Feinebecker and Smith put it in a book that I highly recommend. It's really well written, really easy to read, and really entertaining about kind of the future of work. It's called Work, Want, Work. They talk about this, right? And here I quote, right? But digital companies in general are also highly motivated to change our behavior, right? Not only in the sense of making us dependent on their apps for tasks we use to perform for ourselves, but more generally in the way these companies are incentivized to find ways to get us beyond the platform. So think about a UBI and a world in which work is not, wage work is not at the center, but apps and providing constant data and a stream of data is the way to make money. We will be providing that data for free. We will be on the platform, getting a UBI from the government, providing value to these companies for free, right? That is akin to free labor, right? That's what before I was saying, free labor. So it's no wonder then that the arch capitalists at the top of these companies are among the most enthusiastic defenders of the idea of universal basic income, if it means its recipients can spend more time at home on their devices. Again, giving that data for free. So it will become a type of free labor. So that scenario, the kind of capitalist scenario, I will not get into it because basically it supposes a continuation of the machine. So it's not a disruption, and what we're looking in this blog is disruptions of alternatives to that model, and how can we think through that model from a transnational perspective, or like zoom out from the specific nation and think about at a global level how that will work. And this capitalist version is basically a fine-tuned version of what we have already, or what we already have. Right? So I'll be looking at the sort of like socialist side of things. And I want to, what's interesting here is not in us understanding this future socialist post-work society as a utopian alternative, or the other side, which is, okay, how impossible it is that this future socialist society can function, how impossible that is, because it's basically pie in the sky. So that's not the framing. What I'm really looking is the proposal of this post-work socialist society, how problematic it is by its own accord, by the principles it proposes, not so much because it's just because it's a utopian, unfeasible idea or even undesirable idea, but by what it proposes, by the principles it goes by, why it's simply not desirable. Especially when we look at this from a transnational perspective. Yeah. So one of the main problems that we have in this socialist post-work vision is the idea of necessary labor, of how we get there and when it comes to this society in which work is not relevant anymore, we cannot escape the problem of necessary labor, that some products, some basic products will have to still be produced. And not only they will, and we can think they will be produced in the future by machines, but before you get to the machines producing the products, there is a whole chains of decision making and chain of exploitation, as I will point out later, that comes with the creation of those products. And how can you avoid that change of extraction and exploitation to create that utopian future in which there won't be exploitation? It's the real problem. How you get to that utopian, unexploitative, unoppressed vision of the world through exploiting and extracting value all throughout the way. Yeah. So let me play a clip. Let me let you play a clip of Alex Gurevich from Brown University, who is basically one of the most prescient voices around UBI and kind of a critique of UBI from a leftist point of view, right? And that's why his arguments resonates so much within the left, because precisely he's coming from a place from the same kind of socialist camp, right? He's a post-Marxist political scientist. And his critique of UBI is very interesting.
And there's no work ethic. The problem is, the minute you ask how a UBI is supposed to work in this society, it turns out it presupposes the very thing it says it's getting rid of. And the reason is this: a UBI can only be emancipating for each individual if you can use your income to buy things. And it only works if you don't have to work in order to be able to acquire your basic goods. So it means that there already has to be available a bunch of goods that you can buy, and not just any goods, right? It's no good if it's like watches, AirPods, and tennis balls. It's got to be basic goods. And it's not just got to be basic goods, it has to be enough basic goods in enough quantities that everyone can buy them without inflating away the value of their basic income. And that's not even enough. It's got to be enough basic goods, not just available today, but tomorrow and in the future, which means that not only do we have to produce basic goods, there has to be the production of all the raw materials and all of the industrial capacity to continue producing those basic goods in agriculture, transportation, industry, and so on, such that they're permanently available for purchase by the UBI. If any of those conditions fail, then the UBI can't be emancipatory because you can't use it to buy your basic goods, and you've got to find some other way of acquiring your basic goods. But what that means is, it presupposes somebody's producing those goods. So the UBI presupposes the necessary labor that it says it emancipates us from, because it can only be emancipatory conditional on a lot of people somewhere, at some point, and continuously over time, producing basic goods. And in fact, it has to presuppose a lot when it says that there's a problem of necessary labor. The post-work socialist society has to presuppose, in particular, a solution to the problem of necessary labor in two senses. It has to presuppose first that some agents somewhere have identified what counts as basic goods, how to produce them, what the necessary tasks are that somebody has to perform, and that those roles are publicly known and available for people to occupy. So that's first sense. So there's a social, political, institutional problem that it has to solve that it doesn't explain to us how it's going to solve. And secondly, it has to assume that there is appropriate labor supply so that people are actually going to show up and do the jobs producing the basic goods. And the problem is, at best, the post-work argument, this utopian argument for a UBI, is ambiguous about its solution to that problem. Because it says, look, what we can do is we can give everyone a UBI and just remain indifferent to what they do with it. right? That's the sense in which this is an emancipated society. But obviously we can't remain indifferent to what people do with it, because what if nobody takes any time to figure out what it takes to produce necessary goods? Within a month, the UBI is not emancipatory, it's a useless bunch of paper, right?
Right. So think about UBI here in the socialist post-work vision. UBI covers all your basic necessities, from housing to food, to even leisure. So that is, in that sense, is not emancipation, because to get there, for UBI to be meaningful, it has to allow the recipients of UBI to consume goods, and those goods need to be created and need to be produced. So there is people actually who need to sacrifice basically their time to get an extra wage, which probably with UBI it won't be even that much more on top of what you get. So basically, the only way that could happen is if you force and coerce these people to produce these goods. And at the same time, you need to think what is going to be basic, what we count as basic. Is music going to be basic? Is cinema and producing movies that, you think about producing of a film, it's in the millions. Is that a basic necessity? I personally would argue it is a basic necessity, but maybe a lot of people completely disagree, right? So then you have all these problems of process, how you get there. And any way you slice it, there is no way to avoid the problem of necessary labor. In this case, the coercion of necessary labor. In fact, it does the opposite of what it presupposes. At the end, if you kind of pushes the argument to its limits, because those products and produce, think about food, are strawberries, for instance, basic. And if you ever pick a strawberry, it's an arduous task. It is absolutely not fun to do that. But you do it in the summer under the sun, right? So maybe strawberries are not basic. Maybe a lot of different produce are not basic. Maybe chicken, beef is not basic. So you have all these problems of necessary labor that simply UBI kind of sits on the sidelines and say, well, that will be solved at some point. So it's like Alex Gerbich is saying, at best, it's ambiguous. It doesn't really tell you how you're gonna get from point A to point B with everybody with a UBI, right? With a universal basic income. However, there is a great appeal in today's society at the present time of this post-work ideology, and it's really understandable why there is this great appeal. And you can see in the plethora of dystopian TV shows and films, in which basically what you have is you have to just deal with zombies and you don't deal with everyday life, right? You deal with this other problem, and your everyday life it's completely gone. Yeah, because most work today is alienating. And if you think of that, we talked about this before about David Graeber's idea of bullshit jobs before. But one of the reasons why Graeber's book, which is entitled "Bullshit Jobs," was a bestseller, and an academic book, academic-ish. He's an anthropologist, but he was like really writing for a wider audience. So it's really well written, it's appealing. But beyond that, it's just the idea really took off precisely because people could recognize at the micro level, at the everyday level, that the type of labor that we do is mostly engaging in this kind of middleman type of activities. It's managerial, administrative most of the time. It's uncreative. It doesn't really produce much material value. We kind of are inserted in the middle between producer and consumer. Most people are, right? And there's very few people who actually create that type of material value. And even at the university level, you can start seeing this, and how, you know, there is this unrest among a lot of professors, because we feel like we basically are just producing marks, right? And then you as students are consuming those marks to then get into the job market. So kind of the learning process is being put to the side for all these other things, like the student experience and, you know, all these administrative tasks that everyone has to do. And we kind of have forgotten what we're here for, right? So what's the point of me marking your learning if your learning really takes place through a lifetime, right? It's very artificial and almost nonsensical. So even at the level, you know, of this profession, many of us think that, or feel, at least perceive, that what we're doing in the end is kind of a version of a bullshit job. More and more often. Now, obviously, there is in post-Marxism, I'm thinking here of Max Agel, which I referred to when we're talking about degrowth. There's a critique of Graeber, precisely because if you look at the macro level, you zoom out and look at the structure of how capitalism works. In fact, these jobs are not bullshit at all, because they are very valuable jobs to those who are extracting value from those doing these bullshit jobs, right? They extract surplus, so value, labor value, right? Not because we're producing something, but because we're not something material like in the old days. We're not producing a car and that car is sold, and the time that we spend in that car plus the wage, the difference of how much that car is cost, that's the surplus value, right? So basically, right, my wage plus the time I spend producing that car, and how much money that car is sold, that all kind of Marxist equation, that is surplus value, right? So it's not because we're producing that material object that it's sold at a surplus, for a surplus, for the person who owns the person that owns the factory, right? For the person that owns the factory, but because what we are maintaining here, the product here is the capitalist hierarchy of extraction. That is the actual value, extraction and consumption, right? So think about that. But then, you know, but at the macro level, and think about that critique. But that critique is kind of rendered pointless, because at the everyday level, post-work really is appealing to this leisure society thought core, right? Leisure society all around, where with this alienation of our everyday life won't take place. Now, there is this other point, which again, pushing that argument, that's the critique of post-work ideology is really interesting, because when you start pushing the argument, then you start thinking, what is that leisure society will look like without work? And which is, again, another way of looking at this is how meaningful work is, regardless of how alienating work is, because two things can be true at the same time. Work can be meaningful and, in fact, anchor the way our societies function, and at the same time, it could be alienating. Those two things can be true at the same time, right? So let me play just a little clip from the Future of Work and Death, because it basically gets to this point. So what happened, or what would it say? Start thinking about this leisure type of society.
It is an uncomfortable truth that with our present model of economics, not everyone is able to monetize their passions. If any of this were to come to fruition, if we learn to make automation work for us, the question remains, what do we do with our days?
There's a good and a bad. The good is that the cost of everything drops. We can solve some of the basic problems of humanity like disease, hunger, lodging. We can look after all the basic needs of human beings. The dark side is that automation takes jobs away. And the question is, what do we do for a living? Some of us will seek enlightenment and rise and will keep learning and growing. But the majority of people don't care about those things. The majority of people just want to do, grunt work. They want to socialize with people as they do at work.
Sennett wrote in his book, The Corrosion of Character, that in late capitalism, one of the great kind of supports for human interaction and for human meaning is the longevity of social relations and the interactions in working environments. And that if that's taken away, if what's required is to be continually responsive and changing in a precarious world, then people no longer find the fulfillment or the substance in what they're doing.
There is an underlying desire for people to do things. You spoke about the idea that people want to be engaged creatively. They want to be engaged, go back to basic Marxist ideas of praxis, and right back to John Locke. They want to be engaged in what Locke thought of as primary acquisition, mixing their labour, either their creative thinking or their physical labour even, with the world in order to transform it. They want to do that, and that's a very basic human instinct to do that. And the idea of a leisured class, as it were, a class who is not involved in a praxis with the world, but is simply involved in a passive way as a recipient of things, is actually repugnant to people. They would sooner work for the man in a meaningless job and construct a false ideology of involvement and engagement than they would actually sit on their arse.
We can't get away from the fact that people work because they have to. That's, the primary motivation for most people, that if you don't work, you're going to be living on the street, okay? If we ever move into a future where that's not the case and people don't have to worry about that, then we can begin to take on these more philosophical questions but we're not at that point yet. We can't pretend that we are living in an age where that necessity for an income doesn't exist.
Right, that's another good point. Well, that's sort of a random point before we get there, which is some of the points that we're making. We should start thinking about what we can do now, right? But this idea of being involved in a praxis of primary acquisition, Locke's idea of primary acquisition, it's constant throughout the history of societies. If you look at any type of society, that praxis, that way of relating to others, has worked at the center of social relations. Work is at the center of social relations. When we say work, it's the creative construction of something that is done in public. That something could be an object, but it could be something immaterial, like a stone, right? So that kind of praxis, it's rendered meaningless if you're only a passive recipient of other people's praxis, right? So if that leisure has only to do with your self-indulgent goals, your individual desires, and they sometimes might involve other people, but they begin at the start, at the core, the very essence of that leisure has to do with what one as an individual wants, and that sometimes coincide with other people want. But in a leisure society, that probably, most likely, won't be the case. You will have many different ways of thinking about things to do with your time. More importantly, and here is with Duranty, one of the assigned, Jean-Philippe Duranty, one of the assigned readings here, when he talks about more importantly, is that that society, right, we would have to unlearn a lot of things in the way we relate to each other, with work at the center, right? And this poetic sense that that anchors social relationships. And here, poetic, like I said before, is not poetic but poetic. Refers poiesis is the creation, the creative activity that engage in a social reproduction, right? It's a creation or a recreation of that thing, that it's done in a public way, that it belongs to a public function and is not private or self-indulgent, that the origin, the starting point is to have that, it's a public creation. Think about here art. Art works in a public way, is never done for the self. And if it's done for the self, nobody can see that art, then it's something else. You can call it, whatever you want to call it. You can call it a drawing. You can call it that. Art has a public. It's public at its core. A song is public at its core. You could do it for your own very reasons, but that song needs to be heard by other people, right? And it's always been the case. If you look at the history of art, it's always been the case that art, it's always public. There is always at least another pair of eyes that need to see that art. Otherwise, it's meaningless. Otherwise, it's just that when art is private, it's not art. It's whatever you want to call it, but not art. But it's not only that one in this type of leisure society, and here I'm quoting Durante, that we will lose the anchor point that ties us to reality, but that we may well start indulging in ravings that would most likely be not so benevolent. So it could be that people want to pass their time punching other people because that's what they like. They want to fight, and then there's not enough people that want to fight them back. So they will start just fighting people, right? If that's because that's the way. And that is not completely crazy to think. You might want to think that, okay, that could be organized, and some people want to fight each other, but nothing will prevent you from getting that a step beyond and start thinking, well, actually the most appealing of fighting is not that we do it in an organized way, but that we do it in an organized way. And here I'm not trying to suggest that a leisure society is a society where there is no norms, there is no rules, but what I'm trying to say is you push the argument to the limit. So it's not a Hobbesian type of argument. I'm not saying that that man is the wolf of man, and then we need this kind of authority to oversee us to kind of control all these basic instincts. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that that leisure society will get at best bored, and at worst it will come up with kind of perverse ways of passing the time, regardless of the rules. And breaking the rules precisely is the incentive of these perverse ways. It's not the other way around, right? The rules is what? If there's no rule to break, then there is no perverse incentive, because there's the perversion implies that you have a rule in the first place, right? So to bring this point home in the end, is that again, without looking at the most kind of dystopic, Hobbesian scenarios in which this not so benevolent leisure activities could take place, but looking at sort of a more let's say more benevolent or less cynical way of looking at this, is that we will have to come up with all these meaningful activities all the time to support that will be only supported by self-motivation. But what is it that we want to do? And that, it's will be hard to sustain, because you're thinking about a whole lifetime of that, a whole lifetime of coming up with meaningful activities that have no public or that not necessarily won't have a public purpose, right? So, another kind of turn of the screw here is basically you put technology at the center of it, and you say, well, that's all these other problems can be solved by technology. And then you have Bastani Manifesto, which is basically a satire of the way, especially after the GFC, private debt was socialized, right? And I was talking about basically the other side of the coin when you talk about fully automated luxury communism. It says, well, everyone with, if we're doing this for billionaires and we're bailing them out, we're bailing out the banks, why don't we bail out people and we can actually give Cartier to everyone, right? That's sort of the provocative statement. But despite this being satire, there is something at its core, at the essence, that really is also at the core of the post-work, and especially techno-socialist utopia, when you have like basically robots working for you. That has to do with the presupposition that what's good for everyone is clear, and what everyone desires, it's also clear. And that is far from clear, especially if you read it's really well put in Van Becker and Smith's book, Work Won't Work. And in there, what they argue, it says that all these anti-work advocates, this kind of post-work socialist vision, they often want to liberate us from work, only to condemn us to their own sometimes worthy idea of a good time. So basically, it's a very narrow idea from the top of what a good time is. And that's not clear. And what a good time is always relational, because a good time has to do with how much of a not a good time you're having to have that good time, that good of a time. If you don't have a bad time, then you don't know what a good time is, right? So desire only works when your desire is blocked, is prevented. And this is kind of basic psychoanalytic Lacan, really. And we're not gonna get in there, but it's important to understand, right, that predicament of basically identifying what a good time is or what a basic need is at all not clear, right? Now, beyond this problem of this techno-socialist utopia in which that technology will solve our problems and basically robots will work for us, there is something important that should be rescued. That is the focus on human-centric labor, because really, this techno-socialist utopia, in the end, is saying that all these kind of meaningless jobs and the attack on work ethic is important because we need to put human at the center of our labor theory, right? And then human care should be rewarded and at least should be taken into account in a much more meaningful way. And that is important to salvage. I think that's probably the most important part of this kind of vision, and the vision that I would actually salvage. That being said, I think post-feminist theory that we kind of talked about here, and the idea of care and solidarity, it's already kind of talked about this. So kind of my point would be, like, we don't really need techno-socialist utopias to talk about human-centric labor and human care, right? You already have kind of feminist theory talking about that as a theory of power, basically, putting the equity between men and women not as a policy, but as a way to revert the current power relationship in which human care, which is done by women and not rewarded, is now rewarded, and it's extended to the way our societies would work, our polity function. Now, with that in mind, right, we still have a basic political problem, which is that thing I've hinted before, right? This, how do you get to that point? How do you get to that techno-socialist utopia, to that post-work vision, right? Because to get to that level of freedom, there has to be massive redistribution, right? Not only that, and here a transnational vision is really important. And from a transnational perspective, we need to start thinking about neo-colonial relations when producing the technology that will save us. So are we going to accept the neo-colonial relations that we have in our transnational geopolitical relations, in which a part of the world is producing the raw material for a tiny part of that world to have an iPhone or to have this type of technology? Are we going to sustain that, or do we need to dismantle that? Because if we need to dismantle that, then that technology won't be possible, at least at the present moment. On top of that, how do you convince those transnational corporations today that hold that type of extractive power, and they're making that much money and they're extracting so much value? How are you going to convince them to give up their current extractive powers? So how are you going to get there? And that's the key questions. Because really, a question that need to be asked is why we should be waiting for the future while we can have a utopia now. Because really, if you look at wealth distribution, and this chart, which again, by the way, the source in here, it's very small, but it's from Credit Suisse. So, not a particularly leftist think tank in here. So, and, any way you slice it, we have a problem of massive inequality. There's been criticism about this chart because, wealth, the way wealth, you need to count wealth in relative terms. So basically with the cost of living or where that wealth is located, it's not the same having $1 million in South Africa than $1 million in France. So it's obviously not the same. But in any way you slice it, we have a massive, the big issue. There's two big issues that I would argue in the 21st century. One is the climate crisis, and two is global inequality, massive global inequality. Any way you slice it, you have 1% of the population owning basically 50% of the global wealth. It's telling you that is a massive political problem. So why don't we redistribute that? And the answer to that is because it's almost politically impossible unless you have a massive violent revolution. So you need to be advocating really for a massive violent revolution, because that not only that small percentage of people hold that much, because in the end, if you actually start looking at it, if you compound it, it's not really 1%. It's not just 1%. That 1% hold a lot of wealth, but that wealth is tied to another roughly 10 to 20% of people that depend on that wealth too, right? And that is 20 to 30% of the global population is a lot of people. It's a minority, but it's a lot of people. And for them to give up that type of privilege, I think that you're going to have to have a violent revolution. And if you want to advocate for a violent revolution, so be it. I'm not going to be the one advocating for that. And regardless of anyone's position, it is a very distressing scenario, to say the least, right? So the reason, again, like Will Self argues in here, the problem is not the future, the problem is the present. The reason we have these inequalities, these rich people, is because we need poor people. There is poor people in the Democratic Republic of Congo that need to dig out coltan for us to have iPhones. There is people slaving away in China for us to have cheap produce here. So unless you find a way to dismantle that system very quickly without violence, we'll be looking at a very distressing scenario, right? So that is another big issue of this post-work society. How to get there, and that how to get there, why wait in the future and why not do it now? The answer to that is because it's basically politically impossible, right? So to end this lecture, then there is a way out, in the sense that I think, looking at Black Mirror, the Netflix TV show, which was actually a Channel 4 TV show in the beginning, really start telling us that this post-work vision is not feasible, because that kind of utopian future is tainted by our dystopian present. And really, what Black Mirror does very well is precisely talking about that future that is very dystopian, to really tell us that what is dystopian is not the future, but it's our present. And this is the way you escape that, paradoxically, this is the way you escape that post-work vision, and you kind of ground yourself at the present and understand that the future is only a projection of our present. Our present is very dystopian. Therefore, and that Black Mirror is saying is our present is very dystopian, the future will be very dystopian. What the post-work socialist vision is saying is, I don't want to look at our present because it's very dystopian. I choose to focus on our future, because a future that is void of the present could be utopian. Because our present is so dystopian that doesn't allow me to look at the future in a utopian way. So what I will do is stop looking at the present to just focus exclusively on the future, to create this utopian, ungrounded, unanchored vision. And that's why that post-work socialist vision doesn't work, because for this vision to work, needs necessarily to escape that dystopian present that we live in, right? And that's basically what I think Alex Mathers is doing when he looks at the end of this fantastic episode of the thing season 2 of Black Mirror, 15 Million Merits, and he look at this scenario, and it's basically looking at the paradox of this scenario and how really the future, the dystopic future that the episode is presented, has to do with our dystopic present. And if that's the case, then we should not, or we should stop engaging with these utopian visions of post-work and deal with our dystopian reality of work, right? And that has to do with the idea that, as I've quoted before, Mark Fisher proposed in Capital Realism, and how we cannot really escape our capitalist present, right? And because capitalism seamlessly occupies the horizons of the thinkable, we cannot imagine a way out of capitalism, because the only way to imagine the future is through the worldview of the present. And the worldview of the present is full of capitalist realities, of capitalist imagination. So then what we have is what Becker and Smith in World War I talk about is the Jetson fallacy, whereby we assume that the characters, the identities, and the desires of future people can be assessed according to those in the present, even if we assume everything else about life in the future to be different, right? We think life in the future will be so different, but the only way to assess that difference is through what we know in the present. So that's why it's the fallacy. And the Jetson is this 70s animated TV show, right? So in the end, the major critique, or the most poignant critique of post-work socialist vision has to do precisely with this, has to do with the necessity of analyzing our present, and the inability to escape our present and anchor it, and in this case, and for this class, anchor it at a transnational level, and the transnational relations that impede that, not only that impede that utopian vision to be fulfilled, but that actually push that utopian vision to a dystopian future in a Black Mirror way. So to escape the Black Mirror scenario, we need to escape paradoxically the utopian vision of the future and focus on the dystopian present in order to try to avoid that dystopian future that Black Mirror is positing, and don't simply just look the other way and focus on the utopian post-war socialist version of our present, because remember, we cannot escape our capitalist present, right? Okay, so with this, we're finished, and I hope this could be at least wrapped up in specific case studies when we think about transnational ways of these transnational ways of post-work, right? Post-work.